In one word, how would you describe the Cold War?
Senseless.
In 1950, men throughout the world learned to look on the brutal face of communism. Berlin, powder keg of Europe, saw a mass demonstration of indoctrinated young Germans on May Day. France was also beset by communist-inspired strife. Red Union members adopted violent methods to prevent the unloading of Marshall Plan aid. And across the world in Japan, America's stronghold in the Pacific, the busy commies were at it again. Students went on a rampage in Tokyo with something less than successful results when opposed by Japanese police aided by occupation military police. But far more sinister to Americans was home front communism. Union Square in New York was the backdrop for these scenes of red violence. From their ranks will come the saboteurs, spies, and subversives should World War III be forced upon America. Underlining the menace from within was Valentin Gubichev, who received secret documents from Judith Kaplan, government employee. This Soviet functionary in the United Nations was deported following his conviction.
My earliest memories really of the Cold War would be driving. I remember driving to school early in the mornings and hearing news about Vietnam.
You know, I think it was something that was always in the back of our minds. It was not something that, you know, you worried about every day. But I remember, you know, in schools, school practicing for air raid warnings and everyone getting under their desk, which I'm not sure how that was going to solve the problem, but doing things like that. I remember that we were all supposed to create fallout shelters in our basement.
It was kind of an active part of my life because there was always this sort of being on guard, being protected. This might happen, so how do you stay safe and things like that. So, for example, there were drills in school. I remember doing that as a little boy. Also, people in their homes had shelters. And so, for example, in my home, there was, in the basement, there was water, there was canned food and things like that, as if we were going to have to be there for a while. And there was another thing that's sort of unusual. I grew up in the middle of America, far, far, far from the coastlines. So the U.S. military put missile silos and Air Force bases in my part of the country. And so I grew up where you'd be driving down the road and there'd be a fenced-off area, and you knew that there was a gigantic rocket in the ground, that if there was going to be a war, it would open up and the missile would fly off and go to Russia or something like that.
Schools were designated bomb shelters, so there were these yellow signs that had like radioactive symbols, and it was bomb shelters. I do remember having a duck and cover in the early years, really early, like maybe second grade, where we were taught how to get underneath our desks in case there was a nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States.
In 1962, the Cold War was heating up in America's backyard. Since aligning himself with the Soviet Union, Cuban dictator Fidel Castro was an object of growing U.S. concern. A failed attempt to oust him from power in April 1961 through the use of Cuban exile forces emboldened both Castro and his Kremlin supporters. In May 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev offered to install offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. Castro readily agreed, viewing the missiles as a deterrent against another U.S. attempt to force him from power. Missiles began to arrive that summer under the tightest secrecy. Khrushchev's plan depended on getting the missiles operational before the Americans discovered they were there. But U.S. intelligence quickly learned that something unusual was afoot on the island nation. In early October, U-2 and Navy reconnaissance flights provided alarming but conclusive evidence that the Soviets were constructing missile launch sites throughout Cuba.
So yes, I remember it happening amongst my parents and talking about it, but I was a boy, and so it wasn't like I was frightened, or I just knew that something really stressful was happening, and it was on the news a lot.
Well, it's kind of weird, you know. When you go and you do your drills, and one of your drills is to where you're going to go in case a nuclear bomb comes. I know we would think, well, how is this actually going to work? Even as kids, we're like, well, I don't know this. I'm not sure hiding under my desk is going to do anything here. But so it was a threat.
Some of those trapped in the East paid with their lives trying to escape. The despair the wall caused among the people it divided made it a hated obstacle to human dignity. Tonight, the people had their revenge, but not for long. West German police wanted to keep the area clear. The firemen needed room to work, and they didn't want to antagonize East German soldiers on the other side, who lifted the wall away, slab by concrete slab. Tomorrow, Bernauer Strasse will be reopened. Residents will once again stroll the length of the neighborhood, but the bitter memory of the Berlin Wall won't die quickly.
I think if you look at the underlying factors of the Cold War, what caused it, like the long-term sort of the underlying premise, many of those premises are still with us. And with things like happening in Ukraine, what's happening indirectly in Syria, you can see the sort of the proxy still being played out. And I think a lot of the impulses that brought us the Cold War are still there, and I'm not so sure we're done. I'm not sure we were ever done.
We had the Soviets were our enemies. The Soviets were people that the boogeyman out there that we had to watch out for. They were the bad guys in the cartoons. They were the people that, you know, be careful or you're going to die because nuclear bomb's going to drop on you. And
so I really grew up with the lens of the United States is right, and therefore the Soviet Union must be wrong.
Yeah, I remember sitting with these people, and you asked about, you know, who's the bad guy. Russia was the bad guy, and so I'm sitting there meeting these bad guys, and just a sense of, ooh, this is kind of the enemy, and then realizing they're kind of normal people like anybody else.
In '68, when Czechoslovakia was invaded and essentially occupied, that was, you know, that we were all over that. Everyone thought the Soviet Union had gone too far and were oppressing people, trying to speak their voices and trying to find freedom and so on. And there was so that was certainly the Soviet Union was portrayed as a bad guy.
Honestly, it's so easy to indoctrinate children, you know, to think a certain way.
Right,
exactly. I think that's kind of what happened to me. I wondered about Cuba, like what's up with Fidel Castro, and why do we hate him so much? It sounds like what he's doing makes some degree of sense.
Right.
So, but I guess it was probably in high school that I started to see the possibility of, okay, maybe there's two sides.
I think, you know, the sense of Russia and the giant bear being the bad guys was being exaggerated. I think we were doing, you know, some things that were just as bad as what they were doing. And then,
in the sense that there's a lesson to be learned about when you have competitors who see the world as a zero-sum game, where if I win, you have to lose, you know. And when you have situations like that, things tend to escalate to the stage where tremendous amounts of money are being spent. These horrible weapons are being developed. And in the end, it all sort of melted away.
Eastern Europe was someplace that was, you know, completely alien it was, you know, when it opened up in '89, it was a super exciting time because now you had this whole opportunity to see part of the world that had been completely shut off to Americans for, you know, at least my whole lifetime. Never even knew what it was back there behind the wall. Literally, it was a symbolic wall. For example, all Cold War movies, and there was always, you know, some espionage film in which the Soviet Union was the bad guys, or they had a rogue general who was going to send missiles over to the United States.